Hello and welcome to Tech Talk X. The topic today is the changing labor market, the role of automation and globalization in shaping employment. It's great to see many alumni, faculty, staff, students and friends of INSEAD attending from all around the world. My name is Pascal Balzé and I am your host today. I am also the producer of the Tech Talk series. This series is part of Digital at INSEAD and is conducted in partnership with Accenture. Digital at INSEAD is an initiative to advance INSEAD research, teaching, and outreach on global digital transformation. And this Tech Talk X series is dedicated to exploring existing and emerging digital technology and their application, as well as impact on management, business, and society. If you're interested to know more, please visit digital.insead.edu. So our guest today is Morten Olsen. Morten, please put your video on. He is an assistant professor of economics at the University of Copenhagen. He's an expert in the consequences and driver of new technology, in particular automation technology. He has a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Morten will speak for about 40 minutes and we will spend the last 20 minutes to address your most pressing questions. So please make good use of the Q&A tab and the upvote function. Morten, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much for having me back. Obviously, it's too bad that we can't do this in person this year, but on the other hand, I can see that I get to speak to many more people than I've done previously when I've done the TED Talk. So a couple of years ago, I did this talk and I talked about when or if robots are going to take your job. And this year I thought I'd take it up a bit and I'm going to ask, when will either the Chinese or the robots take your jobs? That is, we're going to talk about how over the last 40 years, globalization and technology has shaped employment and the labor markets and income inequality and so on. So that's going to be the topic for today for the next hour. Now, obviously, we're not the first to ask this question. This is an age-old question of what are the implications of technology and or globalization. If we start here up in the left, the Luddites 200 years ago in the UK would sneak in the middle of the night and then smash the machines that had stolen their jobs away. This was actually quite a problem in the early industrialization in the United Kingdom. And they didn't solve the problem until they arrested all of them, chopped the head off half of them and sent the rest of them to Australia. Likewise, there's been concerns about the effects of globalization for centuries. Back during the Great Depression, most countries initiated by the United States put large barriers to trade in hope of protecting their own industry and employment in their own industries. And that's still attributed to having had a considerably negative effect on the Great Depression. And then obviously every now and then, sort of every 10 or 20 years thereafter, we hear new worries about the effects of globalization and the effects of automation. So that's basically what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about what does the economic literature have to say about these two questions over this period of time. Now, in order for things to be a little bit more interactive, let's start with the following. Let's ask all of you whether you're worried about losing your job to foreign competition, whether you're worried about being replaced by a robot or artificial intelligence, or if you're not worried about it at all. And while we do this survey, let me just briefly reflect a little bit about how I intend to present things today. So the economic profession is quite US centric. And that's basically, for some reasons, it's not too bad of a thing. The US is a big and important economy. It's large, so it's easier to do statistical analysis on it. And a lot of things tend to happen first and biggest in the United States. Today, however, it's going to be quite important to disentangle the United States from other developed economies. I am today going to focus on developed economies. So I want you to think about the US, Europe, a few countries in Asia, but I'm going to draw a distinction between the US and other of these countries. Oh, that's quite a bit. 61% of you say that you're not worried at all, and about evenly about foreign competition and AI. Let's, as we go along, remember this survey and then see if we can use something in the presentation today to talk about whether that is warranted or not. Now, I started out by saying that for 200 years, people have been worried about the effects of technology or globalization on employment. So we have to start out with asking the question, why is unemployment still so low? Now, obviously, unemployment is not low right now because of Corona, but just a year ago, unemployment in many countries, both United Kingdom, United States, Germany, and so on, was amongst the lowest it's ever been. So it certainly hasn't been true that over the grand scheme of history, unemployment has increased substantially due to technology and unemployment. So another way of phrasing what we're doing today, if we're going to ask our question, are we worried about losing jobs to globalization and technology in the decades to come? Why hasn't that happened before? Globalization and technology are things that have happened for literally centuries. Now, although unemployment hasn't gone up, there's been substantial changes in income inequality. This is just one measure of income inequality. It's the share of the total income that goes to the top 10%. And we see that overall it's gone up, but it's in no mean has gone up everywhere. So United States is going to be an outlier here. Unemployment inequality along this dimension has gone up substantially. But for instance, in France, it hasn't really increased over this period, with a lower increase in Sweden and a substantial increase in China as well. So we see two facts here. Unemployment hasn't gone up, but in some countries, there's been an increase in income inequality. Now, obviously, just because something hasn't happened before, it doesn't mean that it can't happen in the future. That's a classical fallacy. So things might be different now. So I plotted two things here. On the left hand, I plotted some work that I'm doing myself, where we're basically using machine learning algorithms to read the text of millions of patents and classify them either as whether they automate labor or they do not automate labor. And we've seen there's been a substantial increase in the fraction of patents that have these characteristics, in particular in Germany, and less so in an already technologically advanced economy like Japan. At the same time, the trade deficit between the US and China has grown substantially over the last 20 years. So the question is whether things are different now than they have been before. So that's obviously the question we want to ask. So to start out with, there hasn't been a loss of job, but there's been increases in income inequality. And we can easily think of cases in which a naive application of the Luddites' way of thinking would have led to large unemployment. It used to be the case that 50 to 80% of all employment was in agriculture. Now there are few developed countries in which it's more than 5%. At the same time, textile production used to be a large employer, and now it's basically a non-existing employer in rich countries. But again, unemployment hasn't gone up. So income inequality, as we saw, has been rising. So we have to ask the question, how does globalization differ from technology, and whether these things are different today than previously? So let me just start out with the standard argument an economist would give at dinner for why technology and globalization doesn't necessarily increase unemployment. It goes something like this. Imagine I have a factory and I have a guy employed for $50,000 a year. Now I'm offered a robot that basically can replace this guy, and it costs me $10,000 a year. So I want to do that. I do that and I let the guy go. Now, on the one hand, I clearly spend $10,000 in the robot industry, so demand goes up there. But the guy loses his employment and his yearly income of $50,000. But something else has to happen. So one of three things have to happen when I've reduced my cost. Either nothing else changes and I just make $40,000 more as the owner of the factory, or I lower prices, in which cases all of my consumers have more money to spend, or quite possibly at the same time, I lower prices, thereby increase production, and then I actually hire more people in other occupations. But the bottom line here is, if I save money on this guy, 50,000 on this guy, someone has 50,000 more to spend. Demand is going to go down in one place, it's going to go up in a different place. So it might be that it goes up in the spending on completely different things. I might now have more money, and then I'm going to take my kids out to restaurants in Disneyland because I spent less money on the worker in the factory. Now, obviously, the only way this would not increase unemployment is if this guy is able to move over here. So if this guy can become the waiter, that is, we can reallocate the labor, then unemployment will not go up. If he can't move over, we might have different problems. So I'd like for you to keep that in mind. We're going to keep in mind, how do these things happen in terms of the reallocation of labor from sectors that are experiencing a decline in demand to sectors or jobs that are experiencing an increase in demand. Basically, the story is the same with globalization. I could have said the same thing, just with hiring people that at a lower wage in Asia, as opposed to having my guy employed here in the West. So that's fine. That's theory. That's economists talking. So here we obviously want to look at the data. So we want to ask the question, what does the data say? Let me just narrow down a bit what I mean about globalization and what I mean about technology. Generally about globalization, we mean things like trade, migration, and then various versions of free capital flows amongst countries. Those are all interesting. Today, I'm just going to talk about the international trade. You're welcome to ask about some of the other aspects in the Q&A. And by technology, I'm going to think about computers. I want you to think about computers in the 20th century, and I'm going to think about robots in the beginning of the 21st century. And then AI or things like this, we can talk about in the QA as well. It will be helpful for you to think about the period up until around the mid to late 90s and the period afterwards. I'm gonna do a cut in there and see that things look different in the two. So how does one go about doing empirical analysis in this? So there are basically three approaches. We can either take industries and see which have been most exposed to international trade and or technology. We can do occupations and ask the same question. Or we can do regions, typically regions within a country, and do the same question. And then compare those and see what's happened between regions, industries, occupations that have seen large increases in technology and those that have seen less. Now, one problem throughout here is that we have much better data on trade than we do on technology. I can basically go online and see how many white tennis shoes for women did Vietnam export to Portugal in any given year and how much did they cost. But I cannot go in and see a comprehensive view on what technologies the different firms invest in over a period. So that's actually going to be a problem for this analysis. I'm going to show you how we try to get around problems like this. So let's start out first by asking the question, what is the effect of international trade on various things that we care about in the end of the 20th century? And we're going to take the first approach here. We're going to do it with industries. Now, it actually turns out that in the 70s, 80s, and at least in the beginning of the 90s, there wasn't that much of an effect of trade on employment and so on. You would expect us to see something along the lines of industries that are very exposed to trade would see declining prices. They didn't really. Industries that are very exposed to trade would see reductions in employment. They didn't really. There were really not strong effects from international trade on employment and wages and so on in the 80s and the 90s. From a certain perspective, it's not too surprising. So international trade wasn't that big in the 70s and the 80s, certainly not in a big economy like the US. And at the same time, a lot of the trade was between developed economies. So what I plotted here is the dark blue line is north-north trade, and that's basically trade between advanced economies, and south-north trade, which is the stapled line here, which is trade between advanced economies and developing economies. And we see that back then, there was a lot of trade between advanced economies. So if France sells a few Citroëns to Germany and Germany sells a few Volkswagens to France, there's really no need for it to sort of have a dramatic impact on the economy in either of the two countries. That's basically what we saw during this period. Obviously, that doesn't mean that there are no effects whatsoever. We lost textile production in Western Europe, and the Americans had a difficult time competing with the Japanese in car production, but there was little overall impact of trade during this period. At least that was the conclusion from economists. They concluded that there was little effect. So if you see economists during this period, this was largely the conclusion. Now, let's ask about technology during the same period. Now, what really happened during this period is computers. So we went in the 70s from not really having computers to computers and internet being ubiquitous by the late 90s and the early 2000s. The problem here is all industries use computers. It's difficult to disentangle something. So what we're going to do instead is we're going to ask what occupations are most susceptible to being replaced by computers. Turns out that a convenient way of looking at this is to do a 2x2 matrix. Now, we actually have incredible data on what different occupations do, sort of down to the details of how much time a secretary spends typing up letters, sending letters, filing cabinets, and so on. So what often turns out to be a convenient dichotomy is one between manual labor and cognitive labor. So manual is using your hands and legs, and cognitive is using your head and fingers, and then routine and non-routine. By routine, I don't mean boring. I mean something that's easily codifiable, meaning something we understand well enough that we can tell a computer how to do it. My grandfather worked in a bank in the 40s. And his first year in the bank, his job was basically whenever people came in with money or withdrew money, to go in a physical book and calculate by hand how much they now had in their bank account. So my sister and I used to play this game with him when we were small, where we would come up with big numbers that we either add or subtract, and then we would see whether we could do it faster on a calculator than he could do it in his head. And you really had to go up until like 8 or 9 digits before we could do it faster on a calculator than he could do it in his head. So that's an amazing skill that's completely useless, because the one thing computers can do incredibly well is adding and subtracting. So I'm going to call that type of work routine cognitive. And obviously now we no longer have these people were called computers before we called them electronic machines computers. He would have been here in the cognitive non-manual routine tasks here. And you can think of many other things in the 80s that would have fit in the same scheme: secretary, low-level accounting, and so on. So the way I would like for you to think about two waves of technology in the 20th century is, first, we had a wave of automation in the mid-20th century. That's basically all the routine manual assembly job. That's taking piece A and putting it on item B. Then later on, we had a wave of automation, but computer automation, which were much more aimed at the cognitive routine professions, whereas we still have a difficult time as automating non-routine manual work. Think gardeners, cleaning, truck driving, and so on. And I think all of us here hope that we're in the form of the cognitive non-routine here, and that's why a few of you are worried about whether you're going to be outsourced or lose your job to technology, because that's what we find is the most difficult: making a computer program that basically decides where you want to expand your trade. But note here, this means that the last couple of decades of the 20th century, most automation, namely computers, happened in this group here. But these are the middle skill occupations. The low skill occupations are here, the high skill occupations here, high salary occupations are here, and the middle are here. That's also what we saw. During this period, we saw dramatic reductions in employment in the middle of the skill distribution, so clerical, administrative, sales, and so on, an increase in the high skilled, and a somewhat non-change in the low skilled. We saw this the strongest in the 80s and the 90s, which is exactly where computers took place. By the way, I said before that I was going to compare the US with other countries. This is the same in all countries. This is basically what we saw in all developed economies. I should be careful. All advanced, rich economies, we basically saw the same trend. Now, let's put that into our scheme. What does this mean? This means that I'm saying someone was replaced by a computer over here, say the mid-level accountant. The firm still had more money to spend. That increased demand. And there was a reallocation from the people who'd lost their mid-level jobs over into jobs elsewhere. I didn't show you that figure, but you can see that for non-college workers, they tend to move down the skill distribution. So you want to think about a secretary losing her job and then getting a job at McDonald's. Whereas the people with a college distribution often were able to move up the skill distribution. And now when I say move, this is over a matter of 20 years. So you're allowed to think about a mid-level accountant who's 50 years old and loses his job, and then where his daughter ends up working in the next generation. So we didn't see much of an impact on employment during this period, but we saw large reallocations amongst skill groups, and we saw a large decline in employment in the middle. So the consensus around 2000, this is taken from Krugman, which is quite a prominent economist, back in the late 90s and early 2000s, was that globalization is simply not important enough to have big impacts, and the impacts that it has is definitely generally for the better. And new technology, in particular computers, might increase income inequality, but hasn't increased unemployment. Growth demand in elsewhere compensated for the reduction in demand in the occupations that were hit by computers. So this is the consensus around the 2000s. What changed thereafter? China. So that's the big thing that changed during this period. So here we have the rise of China, where we have the importance of China during this period. China is the dark blue line here. And we saw that in the 90s, when China opened up, it was basically irrelevant in international trade. And during this period, in particular the early 2000s, the increase in trade from China was enormous. So we're going to try and see whether things are different when we compare trade with China as when we did it in the period in the late 20th century. Now, how are we going to do this? So there's a classical paper, by now classical paper, that does the following. So remember I said we can use three different types of variation. We can look at industries, we can look at occupations, and we can look at different geographical areas. Here I'm basically going to focus on different geographical areas. I'm going to start out with the US. Now, the US, you can split into what we call labor market areas, which are basically geographical areas that are small enough that you work and live within that area. So that can be greater New York City, for instance, or something like this. And then we can look at where in this country do we see that employment is mostly in the routine, as I defined it before, and which one of these different parts are mostly exposed to trade. And why are some of them more exposed to trade? Well, China is good at producing some things. For instance, China barely produces cars. So where China has the biggest impact are in the parts of the United States where they produce things that China can compete with. So now we can compare different areas of the United States that were very exposed to competition from China with different parts of the United States that were less exposed. And we can compare different parts of the United States that had a lot of routine occupations and were therefore exposed to computers versus those that had less. That's going to be the exercise that we're doing now. So first, we're going to do it with trade exposure and the effect on employment. And you see a strong, maybe not statistically strong, but a very powerful negative relationship between the exposure to China on the x-axis and the change in employment on the y-axis. You actually find this in Germany as well. So the areas that are more exposed to competition, international competition, also have a reduction in employment in manufacturing. You find that in Germany as well. Now, obviously, the question is, that's our whole paradigm. Will these people find employment in another occupation or in another industry? It turns out that in the US, they largely don't, but in Germany, they do. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that if I take first the US, areas exposed to technology, so substantial shifts in employment distribution, but no overall decline. So there people move into other industries, whereas areas exposed to trade saw declines in manufacturing employment and overall declines in employment. In Germany, trade did not lower employment in manufacturing. There's been quite a bit of work that I'm not going to talk about here, which ties these type of trade shocks to all sorts of other things. So death of despair, voting behavior, so on and so forth. Now, why would computers and trade be different? Remember, in the United States, we say that being exposed to computers by being a routine occupation doesn't tend to reduce overall employment, but being exposed to trade does tend to reduce overall employment. Now, why might that be? Think about a big accounting firm in the 1980s in Chicago. So they're going to have a bunch of mid-level accountants employed. They're going to have a bunch of secretaries employed and so on. Now, during the period of the 80s and the 90s, a lot of those people are going to lose their jobs due to technology, like secretary, mid-level accounting, and so on. That's the type of things computers are very good at doing. But the firm still exists, and it might even be more profitable now because they have fewer employees. So there's still a high demand for other things, for services, restaurants, yoga, lawyers, and all sorts of other services. So demand has gone down in Chicago in certain occupations, but up in other occupations, meaning that it's possible for people to move from one to the other. So that's the computer automation. Now think contrary about trade. So you have a region in which there's a local paper mill. It's the biggest employer, both of manual workers, of college educated workers, and so on. That shuts down because of trade competition from China. Then everyone loses their job. The whole firm shuts down. There's nowhere else for demand to go up in this region, and it's difficult for these people to find a job. It is true that trade increases demand elsewhere, say in Silicon Valley, but Silicon Valley might be very far away from Wisconsin. So it's more difficult for people to move from the occupations that are declining to the occupations that are increasing. We don't know for sure whether this is true, but I find this to be a compelling hypothesis. And this is something we're still working on trying to figure out. So that's sort of the state of computers versus technology, computers versus trade, where there's been this substantial shift in the appreciation of how costly trade shocks can be, in particular trade shocks from China. So let me ask an additional question. Are things different from robots and computers? So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do an analysis like the one we did just before. I'm going to ask, where are industrial robots used in the United States and in Germany? So here it's just the German equivalent of what I talked about before in the United States. Different areas where firms do different things. They're in different industries, and some industries can use robots better than other industries. So it's much easier to use robots in the car production industry than in many, say, optical instruments industry. So again, we're going to compare areas in the United States where there was a large increase in use of robots to areas where there wasn't, and we're going to do the same exercise in Germany. Now, what do we find? First, the United States, we find negative effects on employment, negative effects on wages, both in manufacturing, but also in general. So we seem to be concluding something similar for robots as we did for the trade shocks in the United States. For other countries, in particular, let's start with Germany. There's a declining employment in manufacturing. So people do lose their jobs in manufacturing because of the robots. But it seems like the employment losses are compensated by increases in services. So people move from manufacturing industry over to the service industries. There doesn't seem to be overall declines in employment from robots. There are downward pressure on wages for manual workers. So it's not great losing your job in manufacturing and having to take a different job, but there seems not to be employment consequences. Likewise, if I look at 17 advanced countries overall, I find little overall effect for employment, but I do find downward pressure on wages for manual workers. So it seems like the United States is different. We don't really know why. This is still an ongoing area of research. One can tell a number of different stories for why Germany and the United States are different. Germany is a powerhouse of manufacturing, incredibly competitive. So trade means that both they might lose in some industries, but they will gain in other industries. It's basically German firms that have built the factories in China that's been very profitable over this period. The United States is also much more geographically spread out, and economic growth is very concentrated in big cities. So if you lose your job in one area of the United States, it's increasingly difficult for you to just go to Silicon Valley and get another job. Whereas the economic activity in Germany is more spread out, and you might be able to find a job in a region that's not too far away. You can tell a bunch of other stories about labor markets being different, the Germany having a better educational system and so on. We don't really know why it's so different between the two. So that's sort of where I want to do up until now. Let me just remind us of where we are. In the late 20th century, we didn't see much of an impact on employment from neither technology, overall employment from neither technology nor globalization. But we did see that in particular, the introduction of computers had this tendency of moving people out of middle skill employment, and depending on whether you went to college or not, high skilled or low skilled employment, what we call job employment polarization, job polarization. In the beginning of this century, however, we've seen that China had a bigger impact on trade than what we've seen previously. And it does seem that in particular in the United States, it has a negative impact both on employment and on wages. So before we go on, let's ask the question, what do we do about this? So let's do a survey and let's ask which one of these that we think it would be a good policy tool. And then we can talk about some of those afterwards. I've put up 5 options here. There's a nothing. There's a minimum wage increase. That's what they're discussing in the United States right now. It seems like they will not, as a part of the COVID relief, do a $15 minimum wage. There's the rollback globalization. That was at least the rhetoric of President Trump. Bill Gates has suggested taxing robots. And then there's the discussion right now about massive government spending on green infrastructure, on updating the infrastructure network in general, on government spending in general, and so on. So let's ask which one of these that we want to look at while I get a glass of water. Oh, that's interesting. So let me just take it over here. So there's a large favor of massive government spending. So a little bit on taxing robots, and then there's something on minimum wage increases. So we have a few minutes left. So let me actually do 3 of those. So let me start out with the minimum wage. So this is very topical right now, in particular in the United States, but also in Europe, where there's talk about having the same minimum wage in all of Europe. So let me start out with this paper, this figure. So the classical economist argument against the minimum wage is that when a price is higher, you're going to consume less of it. If the price of apples goes up in the supermarket, you're going to switch to oranges. If the price of workers goes up, you're going to hire fewer workers. Now, obviously, how many fewer workers you're going to hire is going to be very important. It's going to be the matter of what is the effect on employment from increases in minimum wages. Now, it's difficult for you to see what's going on here because it's very zoomed in, but let me just explain. This here is around 100 different publications that tries to estimate the effect on employment from an increase in the minimum wage. And over here, it's negative. Over here, it's positive. There are a couple of very influential papers, in particular by Card and Kruger back in the early 90s, that are the 2 down here in the bottom. We seem to be in a policy environment in which people are largely concluded that there's no negative employment effects from higher minimum wages because they're reading these 2 papers, neglecting all the papers out here. The minimum, the median or the mean estimate is somewhere in the middle of an elasticity of something like 0.12. So that's not big. The Congressional Budget Office in the United States estimates that an increase in the minimum wage would reduce employment in the United States by 1 million. That strikes me as a low number. My reading of the literature is that there would be a bigger impact on employment from an increase in minimum wages. But there's one thing I would like to stress, which is that a common minimum wage is a bad idea. So in 2 different dimensions. So this here is the average compensation of employees in various different countries in Europe. Now, whatever you think of having a minimum wage that's higher than the market wage, you cannot possibly think that it should be the same in Luxembourg as it should be in Bulgaria. Because if you put the same minimum wage in Bulgaria as it is in Luxembourg, you're going to completely kill employment in Bulgaria. So it has to be something scaled with the productivity or the normal wages in a country. The same in the United States. So the United States, a state like West Virginia, has a median wage that's less than $15 an hour, which means that more than half of employment might be affected. Obviously not lose half of employment, but half of the workers would be affected by a minimum wage increase. To such an extent that the senator, one of the senators from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, is actually against a $15 minimum wage increase because he's worried about what it might do. So a national level would be a bad idea, but you might do it at a more local level. So the con here is we're already in a situation where these workers find it difficult to compete with technology and foreign workers. It's quite tricky to try and make it even more difficult for them to compete by increasing the minimum wage. I personally would rather see something like negative taxes. So if you make $8 an hour, then your tax is minus 100%. So you make 16 after tax, an earned income tax credit, for instance. But a minimum wage less than $15 might not be a terrible idea. Let's tax robots. So this is a prominent example of Bill Gates, for instance, saying that we might want to do something like this. So let's just start out by 3 different versions of it might be the case that technology is gradually more and more focused on automation, right? You can imagine that there's sort of 2 different types of technology. There's technology that tries to automate what's already being produced, produce it with fewer workers. So that's, say, the automated factory line. And then there's technology that tries to introduce new products and thereby hire more workers. That's, say, the invention of the automobile. These data tends to suggest that there's been a shift towards more automation technology over this period. The question is whether there's too much. We don't really know. This is an ongoing debate. There's actually quite a few of my colleagues that think that there's inefficiently too much automation. One example is Elon Musk and Tesla. So Elon Musk was obsessed about making a fully automated factory to the extent that he was willing to spend hundreds of millions sort of getting rid of the last 100 employees in the factory. So in the end, he had to scale back because there was some of it that was simply impossible to automate away. But it's possible to argue that there was too much focus on automation. So those are the pros. The cons is that even though we see more automation, we think we see more automation now than previously, overall productivity growth has slowed down. Productivity growth per worker is about half now than it was in the late 20th century. So at the same time as productivity growth is declining, we want to start taxing a main driver of technology. We don't really know what the impacts of that going to be, because the problem is innovation builds on innovation. So we usually try to subsidize innovation and research. Doing the opposite could have serious implications on growth. Also, how do you even define robots compared with general capital? Like, where do we put the line of building a factory which will create employment and employing a robot in the factory which might reduce employment? Let me finish off with massive government spending. And let me start out by saying, right now, many countries in Western Europe, the United States as well, don't have unreasonably high levels of debt. I mean, like, this is a different argument in Italy and Greece, possibly Japan, which have high levels of debt. But in a country like Germany, there's no worry that Germany can't spend its money back. At the same time, the interest rates on government bonds, the yields on government bonds, are incredibly low. So basically, all you have to do is find a project with a positive return on investment. That's definitely feasible, totally possible in principle. The question is whether governments are going to do something like this in practice. So I'm at the University of Copenhagen, the capital of Denmark. And the politicians right now are in the process of deciding to build an energy island, which is basically a large island in the ocean off the coast, which will cost 25 billion euros, and it's going to supply the energy through windmills back to the mainland. And politicians love things like this. It's amazing to put your name on a big infrastructure construct like this. It's unclear whether it makes economic sense to do something like this. So if we start spending a lot of money, we really have to be careful that we're not just throwing it around on things that our politicians think are cool, and only use it on things that are that have a positive return. On top of that, and this is something that's often forgotten, so often we talk about helping these people by increase in infrastructure spending. But then you compare, say, this is a common American debate. Then you compare, say, infrastructure in New York City and say that there are potholes and that you would like to fix, neglecting the fact that the people who don't have employment right now are in the middle of the country. And it might not be that rural Kansas needs a gigantic highway. So if you increase spending to fix infrastructure in New York, it's by no means clear that it's going to help people in other parts of the country. So these projects should be both well targeted and not wasteful. But other than that, it's a great argument that government should spend money when it's very cheap to spend money, if they do it on something that is economical. Let me wrap up with a recap here. So the consensus 20 years ago was little overall effect on employment or income inequality from trade, simply not big or important enough. New technology, in particular computers, favored college-educated workers, but with no overall negative employment effect. The change in view, so there's still debate about this, but this is my reading of my colleague's view. is that the rise of China had a stronger impact on employment and income inequality than expected. That's sure for true. Not much has been done to compensate the people who've lost, and we now see a lot of aggression from this. The recent trends towards industrial robots are showing similar signs of having negative impacts along the lines of China. And overall, these effects are much stronger in the United States than in Europe. Let's try to ask the question we started out by asking while we get ready for questions of whether after this, you're more or less worried about losing a job than you were before. Before we had 20-20-60. And so let me just say while we do this, industrial robots are still in its infancy. So the fact that we're seeing negative consequences, let me put it differently. So the rise of China has happened. China is now becoming a wealthier country. The low wage competition from China is less prominent than it was before. China is sort of approaching some sort of steady state in how important they're going to be internationally, at least in terms of exports to the United States. So you could argue that the shock from China has happened and is probably not going to be as impactful in the future as it has been over the last 20 years. Oh, we didn't much move things. Industrial robots, on the other hand, which seems to look like what we had for China, are only just in its infancy and could very well have a much bigger overall impact than this. So I'm gonna stop my prepared notes here and then open it up for Pascal and questions from the audience.
All right, thank you very much for that. It was a very, very insightful deep dive into your research. So today we have an incredible audience. We have lots of questions coming in. But I will start with a question that I have for you is, do you think that COVID will change any of this?
So that's a good question. So let me start out by first stating that I, along with most of the literature, expect the recession from COVID to be very temporary. So the financial crisis basically dragged on for the recession from that basically dragged on for 7, 8, or 10 years. That's typical for financial crises, but not typical for other types of crises. Basically because the financial system is the lifeblood of the economy, and if they don't lend out, the rest of the economy doesn't work. So we all expect that when people are vaccinated, the economy is going to be back to normal, maybe even more than back to normal, because everyone wants to, go travel and go out to restaurants by late 21, early 22. So this is going to be a short, incredibly deep, but very short recession. There's also a lot of worry about the amount of spending of governments for reasons that I just talked about before with the massive government spending. I'm not too worried about that. The big thing about whether this is going to change in the future is, I didn't emphasize it too much here, but a lot of these trends happen through cities. So a lot of the economic growth happens through cities. And that's obviously because you want to be where everyone else be. If you want knowledge worker, you want to be where all the other knowledge workers are. The question is whether COVID and our ability to work from home will change, whether in the future a substantial number of people will be able to, instead of working in Copenhagen, work an hour outside of Copenhagen and still be as productive. I'm not really convinced that that's going to happen, but I'm also not convinced of the opposite. So I basically expect the economy to look the same 3 years from now as it did 2 years before COVID. But it is possible that I'm wrong on this, that quite a few companies are going to shift towards having more of their work be remote. And if more of their work be remote, why do you want to live in a 2-room apartment, expensive apartment in Copenhagen, if you can live 2 hours outside in a beautiful house in the forest and then have the same work opportunities? So it is possible. It's not an incoherent argument, but I expect the economy basically to look the same in 2025 as it did in 2020.
Good news. Fantastic. All right. So we have a question from JC Secker on Germany and the US. So interesting analysis on the US and Germany. Could one of the reasons be the strong apprentice-based reskilling, upskilling that Germany has enabling workers to move more easily between jobs?
Yeah. So the standard discussion of why, in particular, this is an American view of things, right? So the Americans will say the reasons why things don't work here is because we basically drop the bottom 30% on the education, in education. partly because we have a terrible apprentice system, and partly because there are many colleges in the United States that are not very good. So if these people lose their job, they have a difficult time finding a job elsewhere. Whereas Germany probably has the best, Germany and Switzerland probably have the best apprentice system in the world. So I'm definitely sympathetic to the view that a lot of this can be that some of this can be explained with the apprentice system. The thing is, we don't see these effects very strongly in other European countries. So Germany is really the one that sticks out here. I'm also not seeing dramatically negative impacts in France, and France doesn't have a good of an apprentice system as Germany. So yes, I would like to ascribe some of the effect to the apprentice system. Problem is that there are many problems, many differences between Germany and other countries that it's not clear cut which one of them it's going to be. But that being said, implementing a system like this elsewhere is a fantastic idea. That should be much more of a policy debate of trying to help people that will not go to college, or if they go to college, they're not going to get a degree that will be worth much. Instead, getting one of these very skilled, very competent, and very well-paid job that many people have in the manufacturing industry in Germany. It's actually quite remarkable, right? That a person who just went to high school and then had an apprenticeship can make, 80,000 euros a year doing something very, very high end in the manufacturing sector. It's quite impressive.
And so I think that answers the second question that we have. Now we have a question of Abel van Starveren.
Sorry. Could you say that again?
So we have a question from Abel, and so the question is: will newer technologies like AI and machine learning be a threat to non-routine employment, the 61% where most of us are active?
Yes. So let me use a slightly different dichotomy than I did in the presentation. It's a great question. So remember in the presentation, I distinguished between routine, non-routine, and I did manual and cognitive. And I did that to talk about what's happened in the economy up until, say, the last 10 years, where this has really been the useful dichotomy. It turns out that if you want to go further and you want to look at what has happened in the last decade, you want to think about a different dimension. You want to think about social abilities and not. And the reason I'm making this point is because we can easily imagine AI being increasingly good at sort of figuring out what high cognitive people do. So you can imagine an AI being very good at doing, say, radiology and figuring out what is the disease in an X-ray. They're already arguably as good at that as the best radiologists are. But AI is far from being good at the social interaction. So here I'm thinking retirement homes, I'm thinking about yoga instructors, I'm thinking about teachers, I'm thinking about all these social skills. So here I've done something similar to what I did before, and I'm plotting a different dichotomy, which is high social, high math. And this is jobs that require that, low social, high math, and so on. And we find that low social, low math, let's say the mid-level accountant, have seen substantial declines in employment, whereas those with high social and low math have actually seen substantial increases. So there's a lot of growth in employment in the type of things that it's going to be difficult to imagine AI being able to do well over the next 20 years. Teachers, nurses, and all these sort of caring jobs. So I could imagine that there are more and more people in the cognitive non-routine basket that can be competed away by AI technology. But what's going to be a while is for AI to do something like this. If I may give one additional fact, this is on US data. I'm unaware of anyone having done this on data on Denmark. This is some work that I'm trying to do now. If you look at the entire occupational distribution and you look at increases in income inequality, then up until, say, the 90th percentile, you find that increases in income inequality happen across occupations. So because the engineers are running away from the nurses. But if you go up to the very top, you find that it's happening within occupation, meaning that the best doctors are running away from the median doctors, and the best lawyers are running away from the median lawyers. And in particular with the lawyers, it's because actually quite a few things that used to require lawyers even 20 years ago can now be done by very advanced AI systems. So in particular, sort of reading through legal documents, making sure everything fits and so on. So you can imagine AI moving up the distribution of what lawyers can do. And now it's only the very, very best lawyers, the ones that do the impeachment trial and obviously things like this, that AI cannot do. Then it becomes a matter of sort of having the social ability and the sales ability to interact with people, as say a divorce lawyer, obviously an AI could not do. So but it remains to be seen. I mean, AI is still in its infancy. We basically don't know yet. I think the important vector here is going to be the fact that AI cannot really do these social skills.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we have a question on by Mihail Dragota on what do we do about it. How about the introduction of a guaranteed basic income as a solution? You mentioned, increasing, basic wages, but how about having this guaranteed basic income?
Yeah, so I think there are various different versions of this. So there are two ways people use this term. One is a universal basic income, which is basically that the government sends you a check for 2,000 euros every month. And then there's the one in which the government guarantees that if you make less than $2,000 or euros a month, then the government is going to top it up. So let's take those two in turn. I'm not entirely sure which one the asker is asking, probably the latter. So the universal basic income, just sending everyone a check for $2,000, is incredibly expensive. So there's like 100 things I would rather do before we start sending anyone a check. That would be better apprentice system. It would be better retraining. It would be better school system. It would be, as I talked about before, the negative earned income tax and so on. So there are many things that you can do before that. So I think universal basic income might be a great idea 30 years from now. I don't think it's a great idea now. Topping up people who make less than a certain amount, I think is in principle a great idea. So let's distinguish two categories here. People who work and make $8 an hour, but we as a society have decided that you shouldn't make less than 16. Then if you top those up and you give them an additional $8 from the government, then they make it up to 6. That's basically negative earned income tax that I talked about before, where you basically just top it up with what they're not making. So I think that's a great idea. The question is what you do about people who are not working. Because if you tell people that you're going to make $2,000 a month, regardless of whether you work or not, I fear that you're going to encourage people to not work in the lower end of the income distribution. And it's not clear to me that that's a good outcome. People not working is just not the fact that they don't have income. It's also the fact there's many psychological consequences of it. You tend to be sort of caught in a loop of if you don't work, then your kids are not going to work, and so on. So I'd rather have something like a generous bottom for people who are not employed, and then a substantial subsidy to the people who are employed. So there's still an incentive for you to go to work, even though it's work at a relatively low pay. That would be my preferred. But that's basically just a twist of what the questioner asked, and I think basically it's a good idea to try and help people in the bottom. What I'm basically encouraging here is that it makes more sense for us to do it as a society through the government in some form or another than trying to mandate firms to raise the wage, because I'm afraid that if we do that, we're just going to reduce employment. Then the workers have to fight with three things: globalization, technology, and higher and mandated higher wages.
All right, okay. Here we have a question from Luis Moreno. How will you think all this will affect the world population level and where we all going to live?
The what population level?
The world population level. How did all these trends will affect the world population?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
And possibly, probably, the migration patterns.
Oh, migration patterns. Yeah. So we haven't talked much about migration-led. Okay, let me answer it in a somewhat roundabout way, because I think this might actually be an important question for the 21st century. And then I'm not entirely sure whether I'm answering the question of the questioner. If you look at the 20th century, then all countries that developed, sort of first Japan, then Korea, Taiwan, later China, and so on, all did it in the same manner. So they start out by something simple. It's extremely export-led. They start out producing t-shirts and exporting t-shirts. Then they produce cheap suits, and then they move all the way up to Japan now being the most electronically advanced country in the world. That's sort of the way it has happened in all of the 20th century. Very export-led growth. This has happened because we in the West have been willing to demand and hire a lot of people in this part of the world. Now you can imagine that automation means that we won't need to do this anymore. It's going to make more sense to have a robot and 10 engineers in Denmark than to have 1,000 workers in Asia. So it might be that I'm going to cut off the demand for low-skilled labor in Asia, and thereby depriving them of the ladder that we've used for economic growth in the 20th century. So you're basically cutting off the way all of Asia developed, and you're preventing Africa in the 21st century from taking the same route. So we're not sure whether this is true. I'm actually trying to estimate empirically whether this is true, but we don't know yet. But if that's true, then you're going to see migration patterns instead, right? Because we're already seeing a lot of people from Africa trying to get into Europe. I can only imagine that getting worse if these trends are not going in the direction of Africa. So that's going to be the migration patterns. In terms of total population, I mean, that's a fertility question. I'm not really sure I'm qualified to answer that. It is true that the more developed a continent or a country is, the lower is the fertility rate. So the faster Africa is going to develop, the faster the fertility rate is going to decline, and the faster they will stabilize at some constant level of population, like, for instance, the United States has.
Okay, I think we'll take one more question from the audience. So from Marek, so what, if any, variation of impacts do you see depending on the age in a world economy? So the Western, educated, industrialized, I forgot what it stands for, and the other. Yeah.
The weird or?
The weird economy, so the advanced economy.
Yeah.
And assuming that most of us knowledge workers in the Western world want or must work into a late, 60s or 70s, I'm worried. So Marek is worried about increasing ageism in general, but especially in the context of automation and digital.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So I'm not as worried as Marek, but for pretty cynical reasons, right? So imagine, so the figure I've shown you here is a figure that starts in the other end of the age distribution. So it is true that if we go back 20 years, then men who were, say, in their mid-20s were either in school or employed. We've seen an increase in the fraction of these people who are not employed, who've sort of lost contact with either the school system or the employment market. And sort of the anecdotes is that these people live in their parents' basement, they play video games, but they're not really in school or in employment. So there is true that in the bottom, we're sort of losing people. That's catastrophic, right? If you lose a 24-year-old guy who dropped out of high school, he's never going to get attached to the employment market again. We've actually seen that historically, particularly in Spain, where youth employment is quite high. There are people who never get attached to the labor market. We started seeing that in the United States as well. So that's catastrophic. A guy who's 55, a truck driver who's 55 in 10 years, when trucks get automated and loses his job, might not get another job. And I think as a society, we should probably just accept that that's not going to happen. So we should help him make sure that he's not in poverty or anything like this. But the more important thing is that his kids in the next generation do get a job. More broadly, addressing more directly what Marek asked, I think it's increasingly difficult for people in the older part of the age distribution to sort of accommodate a developing labor market and a changing labor market. That is going to have negative impacts. But I think the best approach is probably just sort of generously allow them to retire. I don't see it as big of a problem as people not being attached to the labor market in the lower end of the distribution.
All right. Thank you very much, Morten. So tell us, what are your big takeaways?
Okay, so I think the big takeaways from this is that in particular technology is the driver of income and prosperity. That's basically been the driver over the last 20 years. And globalization as well allows us to spread that prosperity to the rest of the world. But there's always going to be winners and losers from these impacts, which we've talked about here today. I think it's important that instead of trying to roll back either technology or globalization, we're much more conscious and much more aggressive in trying to address the people who are not benefiting from this. So don't necessarily roll back globalization and technology, but do much more to help the people who have suffered and lost out because of it. I think that's the big takeaway.
All right. Thank you very much, Morten, for all your insight and for the lively discussion with the audience. If you wish to learn more about Morten's research, we will send you some additional reading in the feedback email as well as the slides. The recording will be ready very soon. And if you enjoy our talk today, we have plenty more in the pipeline. So we have Rebel Foods, the world's largest and fastest growth internet restaurant platform on Monday, 8th of March. On the 16th of March, we're launching a new series on career decision management and leadership in a data and AI world. So don't miss out the first one on the 16th of March. And on the 23rd of March, we're going to deep dive into NL and global open innovation and sustainability. Until then, we wish you a good end of the week. And thanks again, Morten, for your very insightful research.
It's been a pleasure.
Time with us today.